The hallmark of a DSLR or mirrorless camera is the fact that the lenses are interchangeable. So a natural question then might be, what's different about a different lens? What kinds of lenses do you need to film your board game YouTube content? And what should you be looking for? Well, let's think about different lenses. The first thing that's obvious in a lens is that some lenses are zoom lenses, can change their focal length, can zoom in on an object to make it larger in the screen. And then other lenses are what's called prime or fixed lenses. They don't zoom in. They've got a fixed focal length. This one's a 20 millimeter. In general, for filming board game video content, you really are going to need to adjust the zoom. For your top-down camera, you'll definitely want to zoom in and get the board as big in your lens as possible. And different size boards will require different amounts of zoom. But even in your front camera, you're sometimes going to want to be shooting a scene that you want a substantial portion of the table visible. And then sometimes you'll be shooting close up just a talking head. So most of the time, you're going to want an adjustable zoom lens. However, part of what makes a lens expensive is how wide open the aperture can get, because that gives you that nice shallow depth of field effect where everything is blurred behind the field in focus. And so it's possible to get a fixed prime lens with very wide maximum aperture. We call that a bright lens or a fast lens at a reasonable price, say $200, $150. Whereas if you get a telephoto lens, it can't open its aperture that wide, and it could be hundreds, thousands of dollars more expensive. So the only exception for a fixed prime lens might be to get one, I think, possibly one prime lens just to give you the widest open aperture, the shallowest depth of field that frames just the talking head. Remember, you're not going to be able to use those when you want the board in focus as well. Okay, so let's talk about, for the zoom lenses, what are reasonable ranges that you're going to need. But before we do, we need to mention the fact that the focal lengths of lenses that are listed on the lenses are related to the sensor size. This is a micro 4/3 sensor camera. That means the focal lengths here have to be translated. If you bought a full frame sensor camera, your focal lengths, your lenses will have different numbers for them that would capture the same view. So you can't use the specific numbers I give you to tell you what lenses you should buy for your camera. It's going to depend on the sensor size. But just to give you an idea, I have two top-down cameras. I have one main top-down camera focused on the center of the table. That lens is a 12-32 or 12-35 zoom. At 12, at the widest view, it can get the whole table. Zoomed in, as much as it can zoom in, and the camera's maybe 4 feet above the table. When it's zoomed in at its maximum, which is 35 millimeter focal length, it zooms in to maybe 2 feet, maybe 3 foot wide, 2 or 3 feet by 2 feet or so. So about this large an area. It cannot get a tighter zoom than that. So I can't use that lens to get a real close-up on, say, a playing card in a game. For that, I need a higher level zoom. I use this zoom for my third camera, which I sometimes mount above, looking down an area. This is a 12 to 60. With a 12 to 60, I can almost get in maybe a foot by half a foot frame size. And if I digitally zoom in a little bit, this camera has a way of cropping in a little bit. I can get a pretty small area, maybe 6 inches by 6 inches, maybe not quite that big. So 12 to, in micro four thirds land, a 12 to 60 is a pretty good size to capture the whole table or as small a region as you would normally want to focus in on. That's for the top-down camera. And that lens, depending on the quality of the lens, you could pay anywhere from $150 used to $500, $600 for a slightly optically better quality lens. And lenses can go up and cost you thousands of dollars. Typically, the more you pay for a lens, you're getting a lens with a larger maximum aperture, which isn't going to matter for your top-down camera when you're indoors with control and plenty of artificial light. So maximum aperture there doesn't matter that much, but you'll also have to pay more for stabilization, which you don't need. Weatherproofing, which you don't need. So you could save yourself some money on the lenses by not worrying about all of that stuff. And stabilization is a big expense in these lenses, which you don't need. Okay, the front camera lens I have is actually quite an expensive wide-angle lens. The front camera lens, which is like a $700 lens, goes from 8mm very wide, much wider than I ever shoot at, to 18, which is more zoomed in than I ever shoot at. But that's a reasonable range. At 8, you'll see the whole room. It'll go high enough to see the microphones, etc. But most of the non-wide angle lenses, they start to get more expensive on the micro four thirds as soon as I go under 12mm. And this front wide angle, I occasionally need to go smaller than 12mm, but not very often. In fact, if you set your counter back a little bit, another foot or so, you would not need an expensive wide angle lens. Part of the constraint for needing a wide angle lens is the fact that this table is so close to the wall. It's maybe 2 feet, that the far end of the table is 2 feet back from the wall and maybe a foot and a half back from the camera. So right now the camera lens is maybe 4 feet from me and it can't go any further back. If you set your table, if you had a wider room and you could set your table back more, you could avoid the need for a wide angle lens completely, just by giving yourself more room. And that may be a consideration when you're thinking about your room. The closer you have to be to the camera, the less space you have to play with, the more that camera is going to need a higher quality wide angle lens. Okay, let's take a break now and look at some footage comparing different lenses, different setups, different angles of the lenses, just to give you some idea of the range of video quality and look that you get from different lenses. What we're looking at here is I've got my camera, I've got the 8 to 18 wide angle zoom lens on the camera, which is my expensive lens. But the zoom is actually set to about 15mm, so actually all of my lenses, all of my normal zoom lenses will work, and the kit lens will work. Those are normally like 12 to 32, 12 to 60 lenses. So as long as we're above 12, those lenses can get this shot and get in this table, and the camera is about 5 feet away from me. Okay. So we frame the shot so that there's a couple inches above my head and that it gets enough of the table, and we can angle the camera to get that right. Okay, that's the first thing we've got control of, the zoom of the lens and the angle of the camera to frame, get as much as you want on the table and give you enough clearance above the person's head, etc. Okay, what's the next thing we have control over? A big one to get the look you want is the aperture. Now I've got this lens now at 3.7. That's as wide open as it can get, which means the ISO, the gain can be fairly low because it's wide open. The lens is letting in a lot of light. But one of the consequences or benefits, depending on your point of view, of having a wide aperture is a shallow depth of field. So right now the focus is on me, on my face. So as we go further back, it gets blurrier, and as we go more forward from me, it gets blurrier. And you can see the text on this card is kind of blurry. Now, if you watch high production talking head YouTube videos, you'll see this wide aperture, shallow depth of field effect is very popular. And if it's just someone talking to you and they're not showing you something in front of them, then often you want to get as much of that as possible. So the foreground is sharp and the background is very blurry. But you can see if you're trying to show off a board game, that's probably not what you want. If you've got a board game in front of you that the viewer is supposed to be following, you don't want that to be blurry. Okay, so that's aperture, and we're going to play around a little bit with aperture to get that right. But the other thing you've got to play around with for that is where the focus should be. So for example, normally when we shoot, especially at 4K, I don't want to be in perfect focus. It's actually more pleasing to the eye if the person talking is a little bit blurry, just a tiny bit, not as sharp as it could be. Unless you're a supermodel, the skin, it's not all that flattering to be in super 4K focus. Okay, so let's look at the first thing. We're going to leave this wide aperture, which is a shallow depth of field and makes things blurry, and we're going to change the location of focus. I'm going to have it focus on these cards up front here, which will put me a little blurrier and the bookshelf even more blurry. So let's try that. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, so it's done it. You can see this card text is now quite a bit sharper, and I'm quite a bit more blurry, and the background's blurrier still. Okay, is this the look you want? This has the benefit of making the board fairly sharp in focus. Remember, it's going to get less in focus as it comes here, and this part of the board is probably a little bit blurry, and I'm quite a bit blurry. Now, if you were filming this, and you were looking at me, would you say that's too blurry? Is the human too blurry in this image? Okay, now I'd like to show you a little bit about what the top-down camera angles and zooms are capable of. So I've got two top-down cameras running now on this board. The first one is my general one, which is running a 12 to 32 zoom. And here it is, you're looking at it fully zoomed out. This is as wide as it can get, and you can see it can get wide enough to get the full edge of the table. That's about 4 feet, 4.5 feet wide, and it's going up about 3 feet or so. 3 feet or so. So it actually can't get it can't get 4 feet deep. But that's wide enough, and that camera is about, I don't know, 3 feet off the table, 4 feet off the table, so out of view of the front camera. Okay, and then, so that's it zoomed as wide out as it can be. And then I've got a second camera that's nearby, which is a 12 to 60, which is zoomed in as tight as it can be. So this is zoomed at maximum zoom for this 60 millimeter zoom lens, and you can see it's focused on this card area. So you've got the widest view of the table, and then the most zoomed in view of the table with two different lenses. And that gives you the range of view. Now, normally if I was filming, I wouldn't be this zoomed out on this table. I would come in a little bit so that you don't see the edge of the table. And let's just do that. So something like this. Okay, so that might be the view I would have for the normal top-down of that camera. The close-up one, I almost always leave on full zoom, or maybe if I'm playing a game that I just want a standard size like 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, I'll zoom in for that. But to show you, I think it's useful, if you only had one top-down camera, this would be your view. And if you wanted in editing, or even in a live stream, if you used something like OBS to zoom in, you could zoom in from the top-down view on this card. You could digitally zoom in, not optically zoom in with the lens. You could digitally zoom in, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like and what the resolution of that looks like. It's not going to be as good as an optical zoom, but one of the reasons I advocate for filming in 4K is so that you can zoom and pan and still have a good high quality image. Now, if you had a good fast autofocusing camera, and the Lumix Panasonics are not very good at autofocusing, but some of the Canons and the Sonys are, you'll occasionally see a board game channel where the camera is normally set on a top-down view, but when the person wants to show a card close up, they'll just hold it up to the camera. Now, I don't have autofocus turned on, so that looks terrible. But if you did have it turned on and you had a good autofocus system, you could do that. Instead, I use a separate camera for that. But it's tricky to get that right because the camera will hunt, is what it's called. Like, you'll be doing nothing and all of a sudden the camera will have to refocus, and because it's not sure if you're holding something close or not. Okay. Let's take a look at how far I can zoom in with my 12 to 32 lens. So if you wanted to get as close up as you could, there's the top-down camera. I've got stabilization turned off as I suggested, so it's going to take a while to settle. But okay, so here's as close zoomed up as I can get on the 12 to 32 lens, or 12 to 35 lens. So you could see if you wanted to have a green screen effect of a small piece like a card, this zoom lens 12 to 32 or 12 to 35 doesn't zoom in enough for that, right? That's as close as big as it can get, given that it's 4 feet above the table, which it needs to be to not intrude in the front view. So if you're considering lenses and you just want one lens to do everything, then you may need to get a 12 to 60 millimeter zoom lens. And remember, those are values for a micro 4/3 camera. If you have a full frame sensor, those are different numbers. So you'll have to pay a little bit of attention to that. Okay, so that just gives you some idea of top-down lenses, how far they can zoom, what the optical zoom quality is versus digital zoom quality. Okay, just to take a look at sort of different camera angles and zooms depending on the size of your game. Here I've set up for a larger game where I need a deeper view of the board. I'm over 3 feet deep on the table. You can see the front camera is designed to show more of the table, but it still gives me about the same clearance. Now we're at the range of this lens that's starting to get into the wide angleness. It's about 11.5. So you could get this angle at the widest setting of my other lenses. My other lenses start at 12, 12 to 32, 12 to 60. So I wouldn't necessarily need an expensive wide angle zoom for the front, but we're at its limit. Now, if I had more room in this room, that I could put the camera further back, then that would even be more true. But right now, the camera is all the way back against the wall there, and it's about 4.5 feet back from me, and it can't go back any further. To get any wider view, you would need a wide angle lens or more space. So that's one of the things you're going to have to consider when you're setting up your table in your workspace. If you have more room, if you have a larger room and you can put that camera on a tripod or move it further back, then you will not need an expensive wide angle lens. You can see already though, this starts to look a little distorted. For example, if I reach up in here, my arm might start looking a little weird. And if I reach out, it looks weird. It looks like I have long arms. So you want to avoid such a wide view whenever possible. And you may decide that giving someone such a view of the table, you can see if you sort of split the screen in the middle, half is devoted to the board, half is devoted to me. And I like that approach. I like showing the full board when I'm talking, but your other option is to spend more time with the overhead shot where they can really see the board without distortion. And when you cut to the front shot, don't worry if it shows the whole board. But if you wanted to show the whole board on the front camera and you had a large board, here it is. I've got the aperture for this setting set to 8, which is a narrower focus so that more of the board remains in focus, and I'm not that blurry. You might even go a little narrower to keep more things in focus. But with this aperture of 8, my ISO is 1600, which I don't like to go too much higher than, so it's a good trade-off of sharpness of the entire board versus gain and noise. But that just gives you some idea, and maybe we'll take a look at an even wider setting next. Okay, just to show you an extreme example of something you'd probably never want to actually film with, but here's the camera pointed down at the board at quite a severe angle and set to as wide as it can get 8mm zoom. So this shows almost the entire 4x3, 4.5 by 3.5 table, and the distortion is pretty dramatic here. If I reach my hand out or out like this, it looks very odd. My head starts to look odd here. But if you really did want to show off a large table space in the front angle, camera angle, you could do it with a wide angle lens. But this is probably more extreme than you'd ever really want to film with. Now you're looking at a shot with a 20mm prime lens. That means it can't be adjusted for zoom. It's at 20mm. And I could actually get this same shot with any of my zoom lenses, but the advantage of the prime lens is that it has a wider maximum aperture. It's a faster lens. The advantage of the larger aperture is a shallower depth of field, so you can see the items on the bookcase are quite blurry. We don't care about being able to see the board because this is just a framed shot of me talking. It's so wide that the ISO is 125, so you can almost shoot this in the dark. And this is focused directly on me, on this, at this distance, which probably is not desirable. It's too sharp on me. So let's take a look at what it would look like with a little bit of blur. I'm going to set the focus about a foot in front of me. So here we are, 20mm prime lens. Zoom can't be adjusted, but it has the advantage of being a faster lens. I've got the aperture wide open, 1.7. ISO is way down to 150. And now I've got the focus about a foot in front of me, which creates even blurrier background and has a little bit of blur to my face and skin, so it's not quite as sharp and jarring. So somewhere in between focus directly on me and a little bit in front of me gives this nice effect of popping out the subject from the background And this might be one of the rare cases for using a prime lens just so you can get the aperture wider open in a small space. If you had a bigger space, you could set the camera back more than 5 feet. You could set the camera back 8 feet. And if you had larger distance between you and the bookcase, you could get more of this blurry background effect without such a fast lens. But here you go. If you like this look, you can get it even in a small space with a little bit of work.